All right, so Mr. Gerber back as we begin trimester 2, looking at finishing up chapters 21 and looking at chapter 22. So that's expanding cross-cultural interactions with chapter 21, and then 22 with transoceanic encounters and global connections. So within this next chapter or two, we're going to start looking at kind of the rebuilding after the bubonic plague, both in Asia but also within Europe, and kind of seeing how Europe begins to transform from this kind of minor power that's kind of just a regional thing within Europe itself, specifically in Western Europe, and then the expansion into a global power and the reasons behind that and how that connects itself into trade and into exploration. And so we're going to be looking at the reasons behind that and kind of the long and short-term effects of that as well, right? And this will help play into other things going around the globe later on, including the effects it has here in the Americas, as well as the building up of other empires as well at the time within Japan, China, India, the Ottoman Empire, which we've kind of alluded to in the past. And so this is kind of the beginnings of all that information. So we're taking that information that we've learned about so far through the Mongols and the bubonic plague, and now we're going to kind of just pick up where we left off following the bubonic plague, right? So on this page here, so we see the chronology. So this is more of a timeline of exploration. So some of the stuff that we've talked about already, so the Polynesian settlements and movements going in the Pacific Ocean, within the Atlantic. We haven't really mentioned the Vikings too much. We kind of did a very minor thing there. We'll talk more about this stuff within the Europeans, but then we've also talked about, the integration of South Asian maritime markets. So that's the Indian Ocean trade in the basin, going all the way from, Indonesia and into India and China and into East Africa. All right, so this is the stuff we're going to start looking at here, and then also kind of playing in with the Atlantic Ocean stuff as well, and then mention this guy over here, Zhang He, coming up. So, taking up first within China, we're going to look at the end of Mongol rule and the beginnings of the Ming Dynasty, which is the first dynasty to follow the Mongols' Yuan Dynasty in China. Right? So, as we kind of alluded to at the very end of the last chapter, or the last kind of notes, was that the bubonic plague is essentially what kind of brings down the Mongol Empire, all right, as a result of constant warfare, constant internal fighting, and threats to them, as well as the devastation caused by the bubonic plague. It weakens the Mongols to the point where they're kind of saying, okay, well, this really isn't worth it anymore. And then they just kind of decide that they will leave China by choice. They're not actually forced out, but they're like, there's so much internal conflict, poor management, just so many people, rebelling and not paying the taxes that it's just not worth our time anymore. So they actually returned to, Mongolia by the late 1300s. And kind of remain there. Then the other Mongol Khanates kind of fall apart, and many of them slowly make their way back to the Mongolian steppes or the Asian steppes, right? So what replaces them within China is the Ming Dynasty. So we talked about, the bubonic plague happening around, late 1320s, early 1330s within China. So within, 30-ish, 40-ish years of that, the Ming Dynasty replaces them. And so the emperors take a more direct control of the empire and less reliance on ministers out of fear of rebellion. Because, again, of the fear over the Mongols, but also fear of Confucian ministers of the power that they might hold or try to take over, because there was the assassination of one particular emperor right away in the Ming Dynasty that they began to sort of mistrust a lot of their close counselors. Right? And so this framework, even though the Ming Dynasty will only last till 1644, with the emperors taking more direct control, more direct processes than they had in the past, where they relied more on Confucian scholars and other ministers, will last essentially until 1911, when the final dynasty actually collapses, and this is kind of the more modern era within China, right? So some of the stuff that happens under the Ming Dynasty that lasts for a long time is the reinstatement of that Confucian educational and civil service system in terms of the tests and exams. So again, the idea that, even though it's predominantly set for the wealthy to be successful, anyone can move up, with the proper education, training, and resources into civil service society within China, right? And then they also reinstate the use of mandarins and eunuchs to help enforce policies at local levels. And so the reason they are going to trust more of the eunuchs is because they can be trained, in the sense that, for those that do not know, eunuchs are men who have no more reproductive organs. They've lost their scrotum and cannot reproduce. So thus, there is no drive for them to essentially overthrow against the rebellion. And so they trust eunuchs more than many of their actual, close counselors and advisors, because they trust the fact of what eunuchs can stand for. And then mandarins are kind of a they're not eunuchs, but they are like sub-officials. Trust and enforce those policies at the local levels, because again, of the same thing kind of with the eunuchs. Mandarins aren't eunuchs, but but oftentimes don't have families. So there's more reliance on people that can't carry on a family line to trust for the long-term association of the empire and have been trained as such from a very young age. Right. At the same time, the Ming Dynasty will pump a lot of money into the rebuilding programs that while the Mongols had been doing that as well in terms of irrigation and agriculture that the Mongols had destroyed. The ones that had been unrepaired for the last couple hundred years get more money pumped in, and then also, while they're helping rebuild China economically with independent trade in and outside of China, and within the population also rebuilding, there's a more emphasis on Chinese culture and the promotion of more culturally Chinese things. So essentially banning anything that is not spelled out in Chinese. They are banning Mongol names. Stories to erase the memory of Mongol rule, so essentially kind of trying to erase this dark history in their minds. And they also limit foreign traders to major trade ports. And you kind of think of, why do we want to limit major trade and merchants beyond, why do we not want them into the kind of the interior of the country? Why do we want to limit them to this one area? Because they want to, again, promote the economy, but at the same time, they also want to be, probably don't want them getting too aggressive or too big inside of China itself. Right, so that comes up with this guy here, Zheng He. We don't have a real picture of him, helping to rebuild the Chinese Navy and kind of do these Chinese explorations, essentially throughout the early parts of the 1400s into the Indian Ocean. Right, so Zheng He was a Muslim eunuch. He was Chinese, but as we talked about the fact that there are a lot of Muslims within China, he was a Muslim eunuch. Right, and he was a very strong Chinese naval official who led these massive Chinese expeditions into the Indian Ocean as far all the way as we kind of can see here along the map, all the way along the East African coastline. And alongside of it, he had these massive, what's known as treasure ships that could hold over 500. You kind of see here's the comparison to regular what's going to be like the caravels and other types of European ships. Very, very tiny in comparison to these massive treasure ships that could hold over 500 people and even more cargo. That they would bring in all these Chinese soldiers for intimidation, as well as goods to trade throughout, these parts within the Indian Ocean and East Africa, to also bring the fact that, hey, China is no longer weak. We are no longer under Mongol control. We have the ability, because we have gunpowder, but we also can make these massive ships for intimidation. They would bring typically about 30,000 troops with them on these expeditions. Very often they were not actually using the soldiers. They were just kind of bringing them along for that intimidation factor. And essentially, they were bringing gifts and goodwill with the Chinese emperor in mind to kind of say, China is powerful, but we're actually here on a friendly mission to kind of encourage more trade, more exploration, better communication with our neighbors, right? But that doesn't mean they wouldn't actually use their military. They would, predominantly attacking pirates not affiliated with any one society or country, right? On top of that, there's a lot of benefits that Zheng He brings with them. They establish granaries to hold on to and store food. And within the Muslim communities, they build mosques in the cities that they visit. Because again, Zheng He, being a devout Muslim, believes in the expansion of the religion, even if it doesn't necessarily coincide with the government tactics within China. Right? Eventually, he's stopped by Confucian ministers because they look at Zheng He as a threat. They want to invest more in agricultural reproduction, and then the rebuilding of land armies as the Mongols are posing a bigger threat, 70 odd years later. And so these explorations just kind of stop, unfortunately, and there's nothing really gained in the long run here for China, but it does show that China can, in fact, build massive ships and resources and kind of flex their muscle when they had the means and the will to do it, especially, again, right after the Mongol period. This is a reason for them to show off what they are actually capable of, even if it doesn't actually lead to a whole lot, right? So yeah, and then here's our exploration and settlement in the Indian Ocean before and during 1500. So again, here's our Polynesian map that we've talked about previously. Here's the voyages of Zheng He that we just looked at, and then the other kind of movements of people and goods throughout the trading empires, which again, there's a lot of Hindu, Muslim, some Christian trading, some Jewish trading, as well as, Buddhist and other types of trade going on. Right? So that's where we're going to stop here with this first video. In the next video, we're going to talk about the Renaissance period and the rebuilding of Europe following the bubonic plague.